My name is Michelle Yun Maplethorpe, and I'm Vice President for Global Artistic Programs and Director of the Asia Society Museum here in New York. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to Asia Society's 2021 Biennial Arts and Museums Summit. Since our first convening in 2013, the Arts and Museums Summit has served as a dynamic multi-day platform to bring together museum and cultural leaders from across Asia, the United States, and Europe for timely and meaningful discourse as a means to champion best practices in the field and to build stronger global networks across the arts. This year, we're convening online, and I'm delighted to include a greater diversity of voices from across the world. This year's summit, Reimagining Museum Narratives in the 21st Century, will focus on issues relating to decolonization in the arts. Some of the topics to be explored include decolonizing curatorial practices, renegotiating art historical narratives, and deconstructing the legacies of regional colonial histories. These issues will be discussed across 2 keynote presentations, 5 panels, and 4 interactive workshops. A complete list of speakers and the agenda are accessible on the Asia Society's webpage. We're so grateful to all of the keynote speakers, our guest panelists, and moderators for their generosity of time and expertise through this summit. This ambitious undertaking could not be possible without support from key partners, and we're grateful to the Getty Foundation and especially its director, Joan Weinstein, and her team for their steadfast dedication to this initiative since our first summit in 2013. Our appreciation extends to Sharon Corwin, President and CEO of the Terra Foundation for American Art, and her team for the Terra support of this year's summit. Our work is also made possible by support of our members, and we thank those of you who are with us today. If you're not yet a member of Asia Society, I encourage you to join. Your membership provides vital support for our mission and programs. So just a quick note about tech support. As you're all attending through the Hop-In platform, please feel free to reach out to the virtual help desk if you're having any technical problems during the course of the summit. So before we begin today's session, I'd like to share a few additional thoughts. Although the summit is virtual with speakers and participants from different parts of the world, we're hosting it from Asia Society Museum in New York, which is situated on the Lenape Island of Manhattan, or Manhattan. We pay respect to the Lenape people, past, present, and future, here in Lenapehoking, their homeland, and throughout the Lenape diaspora. We also acknowledge that New York City has served as a gathering spot and home for other indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. By acknowledging this at the opening of this summit, we humbly seek to build partnerships in honoring, preserving, and restoring the abiding connections of indigenous communities and nations to their ancestral lands and waters. So at this time, it's my pleasure to kick off our 2021 Arts and Museums Summit with our keynote speaker, Professor Gayatri Spivak, who is University Professor at Columbia University. Gayatri Spivak is a professor in the Division of Humanities at Columbia University and holds honorary degrees from the University of Toronto, University of London, Oberlin College, the National University of General San Martin in Buenos Aires, the University of St. Andrews, Vincennes University, Presidency University from Kolkata, India, Yale University, the University of Ghana, and the University of Chile. Her extensive book catalog includes, in other words, Thinking Academic Freedom in Gendered Post-Coloniality, Outside in the Teaching Machine, Imperatives to Reimagine the Planet, A Critique of Post-Colonial Reason, Death of a Discipline, Other Asias, An Aesthetic Education in the Age of Globalization, and Dubois and the General Strike, which is forthcoming. She has translated Jacques Derrida's Of Grammatology, Masweta Devi's fiction Ram Prashad Sen's Song for Kali, and Ami Césaire's A Season in the Congo. Professor Spivak has been a full-time activist in primary healthcare, ecological architecture, rural elementary education, and feminist social movements, from the sphere of the United Nations to academic theory to grassroots practice. Professor Spivak will talk for 30 minutes, after which I'll join her for a 20-minute moderated discussion, followed by an open session of about 10 minutes of question and answers from the audience. If you have a question for Professor Spivak, please submit your questions via the Q&A tab in Hopin at any point during the presentation or conversation. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Spivak to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, and hello, everyone. I am in Calcutta, so for me, it's a nice evening, but I suppose for most of you in New York, it's a nice morning. I start in the name of the encamped Rohingyas. I am citizen ambassador for the Free Rohingya Coalition and have been involved with them since the 80s. They are the absolutely stateless Asians. We are an Asia society. They are the absolutely stateless Asians, and they represent, for me, a limit to my work. I also invoke the great Asian museums of Baghdad and Damascus, in existence 2,000 years ago and more, but routinely ignored. Regular museum textbook by Tony Bennett invokes the problem of a transition from the European Renaissance to modernity, completely ignoring the transition from the great Asian antiquity through Ottoman modernity into its colonial suppression. I had Khalid Ziadeh's Neighborhood and Boulevard translated in my series Elsewhere Texts. It gives a clear account of this change. During the Gulf War, the looting of these museums was unthinkably deep and wide. Among the looting sites, apparently my own alma mater, Cornell. Surya, you want to put the lady. I cannot begin to tabulate that enormous list. In a span of 4 days, between April 8th, 2003 and April 12th, an estimated 15,000 items, among them Syrian ivories and more than 5,000 cylinder seals, disappeared. You notice how funny this is, talk about colonialism. They call it the Mesopotamian Mona Lisa, when Mona Lisa is about, 3,500 years later than this woman. Anyway, so let me just mention 2 items. An early copy of Gilgamesh and a magnificent sundial by Ibn al-Shatir, who reformed and improved the Ptolemaic system by eliminating cumbersome eccentrics and equants in the lunar and planetary models. And these corrections were used by Copernicus 150 years later, the oldest polar axis sundial still in existence. How do we calculate decolonization, Eurocentrism here, as Iraqis and Syrians today are being plagued by Belarus as they suffer to enter Europe? We are an Asia society and should not forget this as we build on our own problems. I cite here the extraordinary conclusion by a somewhat ignored writer, Christine Brooke-Rose, who points out that with agriculture in this area between rivers, the Anthropocene might also have started, I quote Brooke-Rose, scattering seeds like rain with wide rainbow gestures into the loosened earth as they pass. And more, hordes and hordes of wheat rearers and animal tamers invading the huge forestless plain, the entire landmass, growing grains and greens and fruits and lambs and pigs and horses, and having endless offspring and living happily ever after. This last bit is ironic. If you read the novel, you will know. Their respectful fear of nature, because technology was not bigger than nature yet, is usually romanticized. An anecdote might be useful here. When I presented, Surya, you want the mic. When I presented the importance of agriculture over against map making at the Whitney, the altogether capable member of the museum staff did not recognize a plow because, unlike a tractor, it was too small for her to notice. She only knows machines that are much bigger than the human being in nature. And here she could not recognize the plow. Surya, you want to play the thing? I'm explaining to them, because I'll never do anything where I anthropologize. I'm explaining to them why Whitney needs to see this. So she couldn't recognize the plow. Unlike a tractor, it was too small for her to notice. Some of you will remember that Sita, the feminine transcendental, emerged at the edge of a plow, and that was really my discourse. You have given us the wonderful title, Reimagining the Museum. In 1997, I wrote a piece called Imperatives to Reimagine the Planet. I think we ought to acknowledge the imperatives when we think about reimagination. Imperatives come from outside rather than generated only from our own problems as perceived from the inside. Our imperative today, whatever we think, the imperative that comes from the outside in reimagining the museum may be the reimagination of a completely fungible future rather than our perceived demands for inclusiveness and diversity alone. I speak, of course, in the name of my grandchildren. Surya, I want the picture. Nandara. I speak, of course, in the name of my grandchildren, that the imperative today is to reimagine the possibility of a monstrous future, that there will be nothing for them. We are now being played out by a greater narrative where human accountability is way short of trivial. 9/11 is as unimportant there as the Copernican revolution. Physics doesn't care. As the Copernican revolution, the Platonic solids, the Sphinx's far gaze, or the Great Wall of China. Live with it until there is no living unless we reimagine. Generally speaking, the response to my keynotes, and I'm a bit of a keynote junkie, is from fair to middling, and then to ignored or forgotten, because it is assumed that my long-term suggestions are not practical. I will be in rural India without internet at the time of the closing response, and I have asked my acting assistant director of the schools, Dr. Anirban Bhattacharjee, to find a way of equipping our smartphones so that I can check to see if that is the case this time as well, that is to say, forgotten. However, let me assure you that I have not remained within an educational institution for 56 years without depending heavily also on short-term solutions. Even as I see their limits, the quick solution in this case, to put it very roughly, to decolonize and deconstruct, is of course to network, to locate a, quote, diversified artist base. Each of the other diverse groups generally romanticizes their own so-called indigenous or diasporic tradition, insisting that examples from my language is the best decolonizing tool, considering colonialism as not very much more than violence, cultural violence, exclusionary violence, etc., and thus deconstructible through better employment practices and allocation of resources. I should say here that I have a different thinking about the trans, about which I have written for some years, certainly a decade or more, which I can neither include nor reject in a 30-minute keynote. So I'll just have to allow you to imagine or read the material that I write about the trans position and the subject of democracy. Anyway, when we actually go in this way, the short-term solution, which we must use, the structure of the museum remains the same with some decentralization of governance. The structure of the shows remains the same with some interactivity introduced mostly digitally. You insist the narrative is being changed. It is good, however, to remember Wittgenstein's remark in his late fragments that, I quote the translation, images tell us nothing, either right or wrong, about the external world. Especially since the word images in this attempts to translate the German word Vorstellung, which was in the 18th century for Augenstellung, my Germanist research assistant tells me, especially since the word images attempts to translate the German word Vorstellung more like arbitrary representation for conceptualization, precisely as for the production of conceptual art. Knowing these limits makes our practice stronger. As a result of an astute practice of this short-term strategy, network and diversify, you get much better shows than you used to before, but you cannot just adjudicate this from the summit. Of course, this is a summit. This is hands-on online work at the museum. We as subjects, as capital I's, can go toward the world at large only so far within a self-declared summit situation. The question is, who are the we who, as agents of an art or any intellectual enterprise, who seek to help the world from a summit? How many are we truly as a group within this institutionally validated agency? And even what am I? Autobiographical questioning, avoiding narcissism, a hard task for the imagination. The regular textbooks, even the politically correct ones, sometimes underestimate our calls for change. I quote one of them. Although its specific inflections have varied with time and place, as have the specific political constituencies which have been caught up in its advocacy, the discourse of reform which motivate these demands from the museums has remained identifiably the same over the last century. This is one of the graduate textbooks used across the elite universities of the world. I myself would rather keep the demands recognizably different, as has Michel, and respect their practicality. But, and it is a big but, if you claim theory, decolonize and deconstruct, you must broaden. You cannot stay with the practical short-term solution, but please don't imagine that I don't know it, as you forget me. As Samir Amin, the great Senegalese political philosopher and activist, suggested fairly recently, we have to change our mindset from the fight against colonialism that was started with non-alignment in Bandung in 1955 and recenter ourselves to confront globalized neoliberalism, which turns nation states into global capital managers while encouraging the nationization of identity in the name of anti-colonialism. So we should really learn how to examine our stance when we put so much on decolonization. Although, and I quote a recognizable theoretical book, the conversion of a spatialized teratology into a historicized system of classification in which other peoples were moved from the world's extremities to the initial stages of human history was closely associated with the history of colonialism. Colonialism thus can also provide today a cultural excuse for finger-pointing, they bad, we good, for finger-pointing, which some of us describe as the Mugabe position. It also allows artists, museum administrators, and museum goers to be distracted from the task of combating and restraining neoliberalism by acknowledging complicity. We are folded together with the neoliberalism that we are also going to confront. As for decolonizing by using native language, let me offer you B. Upaniveshayan, the lugubrious Bengali gerund, my mother tongue, created by elite literal translation of the English word decolonization, which I got from the acting assistant director, I've mentioned him already, of my 4 rural elementary schools. There is no way that my teachers there will understand this Humpty Dumpty, that is to say, once broken can't be put together, Humpty Dumpty elite Bengali word for decolonization. Indeed, they will not understand colonialism except as some dates and names given in textbooks. They will, however, understand class and caste because that still works. The intuition acquired in the traveling researches of a loose group called Rethinking Globality, one of the members of which, Professor Lakshmi Subramaniam, is my guest for this summit, is that in globalization and its spurious symmetry, level playing field, the structures of corruption that existed in the pre-colonial longue durée, like our caste system, thousands of years older than colonialism, that existed in the pre-colonial longue durée have become operative in so-called post-colonial polities. Pictures of teachers. I give you the picture of my teachers because I have discussed this problem already with them and will do so again. But they do not understand academic English, so they are muted here, not anthropologized. I will see them day after tomorrow and discuss this with them again. There are 2 who are illiterate here, but their heads have not been destroyed by bad education, and they are certainly my intellectual equals and friends. I can't talk more about them, but I did want them up here because they will not understand this discourse about decolonizing and deconstructing, but they will certainly confront, as they do, the kind of disaster that's happening because finally, after thousands of years, the date of the monsoons have changed so that they are, the wonderful poetic epic that we have, the Cloud Messenger, starts Ashadhasya Prathama Divase on the 15th of June, if you make it English. And that date is now gone. So these people starve. So they know the future, the monstrous future that I'm talking about. The 2 primary considerations in deconstruction is, of course, what has to be excluded in order to define one's truth and how one's truth is produced. My teachers, supervisors, and co-workers give you a sense of a worldwide group, the largest sector of the electorate, considered only as body count for elections so that tyrants can be elected, the largest sector of the electorate is excluded. Unless there is a sustaining structure to engage such people critically in, let us say, museality, even meta-museality, no short-term solutions will last for inclusiveness. Just recently, I suggested to the World Economic Forum that just as there are global medical and philanthropic organizations providing clean water, medical care, education without any involvement with the quality of mind-making, sort of books, buildings, computers, undoubtedly very necessary, so also should there be a correspondingly large civil society engagement in the kind of education I described recently to a colleague in Britain as the humanities component at his university, in fact, Goldsmiths, at his university was being destroyed. The humanities are an ethical healthcare system for the state, not a cash cow. Last year, I proposed to the Comparative and International Education Society a permanent and persistent revolution, a worldwide educational initiative on a thoroughly decentralized cellular model and an ongoing effort to keep it that way. Incidentally, this healthcare, this educational initiative are differently conceived from the healthy mind and a healthy body formulation predicated upon the culture and anarchy model of the museum down from the British 19th century. Even as I speak of averting the possibility of a broken and monstrous future for the grandchild, Nayantara Chandra, born in 2017, I want to invoke the mother, Shibani Chakravorty, born in 1913, 104 years, as her question set me going on the matter of museums. In 1985, I took my mother for the first time to the Louvre. She was a smart, educated, learned, socially active, questioning person, but she had only been to one museum, the Indian Museum in our hometown of Calcutta, built on a colonial model, when undefinable objects became definable and collectible, but the objects themselves were Southern Asian antiquities. You want mothers in my pictures. One when I was 10, one when I was 50, mother and me. But Buddhist and Hindu shading into Islam, that's what she saw. So she walks in, looks at the winged victory of Samothrace, reads the text, turns to me and asks, if it is Greek, why is it here? This is the broad question we ask today when we want to decolonize curatorial practice. Of course, she ignored the fact that Greek art, by virtue of being the best European art, was French, since that was the greatest modern European civilization, because she herself was ideologized into the greatness of India. So it wasn't as if she was innocent. There was something at work there as well. Mother wanted to see the Mona Lisa that had become so globalized that her question about winged victory would not travel there. I did not want to join the crowd, planned to meet mother at the Roman sculptures. She came back with a good liberal response. Such a small piece of canvas gave so much joy to so many millions of people over the centuries. This is the broadest excuse given for expanding the audience at the museum. In our local slang, bringing in the barrio. This is also proof of my mother's liberalism shared by a certain class around the world, leading to the question that relates to the much older one. Whatever happens to my grandfather's picture when it is hung in the museum? And you can look at my mother's picture as it is museumized on my wall at home. See, this picture, photograph is taken in 1917 when my mother is 4, and that's my grandpa. And my mother's, and this is, of course, on the wall in a very museum-like way. My mother's complaint here would have been very much appreciated by Roland Barthes. She told me again and again that she had been sitting up and grandfather had been reclining, and the photographer destroyed the real. So what happens? This is a much older question that relates to the question, the liberal expression that my mother made. And as Mickey Ball would ask, what about the snakeskin on my other wall? Two Shona, there's a much longer snakeskin than you see on the wall. Two Shona men came out of the woods on the northern border of the Zambezi with the freshly killed snake bleeding still. They would eat the snake and throw away the skin. I bought the skin for $4, etc., etc. Many reimaginings there, nature, art, museum, and so on. Let me confront Mother's liberalism, well inherited by me, as acknowledgement of complicity, being folded together with what I critique. I have tried to use deconstruction as affirmative sabotage. Do not excuse by saying art can heal. Do not accuse by saying museum is colonial, but enter that social formation that you are criticizing as thoroughly as you can. Among our hosts, this is not a problem. They are deeply and authoritatively imbricated in the curatorial work. It is a powerful autocritique. So enter to find in it a toehold that will allow you to turn the whole thing around to serve purposes other than the original self-comprehension. The sexy name for this toehold, as many of you know, is, quote, the moment of transgression. The pioneering introduction of land acknowledgement into the Metropolitan Museum allowed me such a toehold. The walls of the museum were transgressed or breached. The walls of the Museum of the Metropolis, had been breached. It has been located as mere built space. Let us listen to Mickey Ball on the Met. It's a passage many of you know. The Met fits all the priorities of its own social environment. Western European art dominates. American art is represented as a good second cousin, evolving as Europe declines, while the parallel marginal treatment of, quote, archaic and foreign art from Mesopotamian to Indian contrasts with the importance accorded to, quote, ancient as predecessor, the Greeks and Romans. As, quote, natural as such priorities may seem, due to what is available, one might say, but why? The difference with the British Museum in this respect tells us that these random facts are not so arbitrary. The overall impression is one of complete control, possession, storage. The Met has the art of the world within its walls, and its visitors have it in their pocket. It is possible to attribute this odd combination to the racism inherent in the colonialist origin of the museum, safely referred back to an age before today's alleged race and gender consciousness. Ball's piece was published in 1992. The Met has made many conscientious changes since then, as it has passed through different directorships. Yet it must nonetheless be said that it might not be, and I say this with great respect from the inside in an autocritical moment, in tune with what I'm saying is our imperative to reimagine. Yet it must nonetheless be said that it might not be enough to appoint the brilliant new associate curator, Patricia Marukin Norby Purepecha, and to include Native American objects now defined as art. Let us read the acknowledgement, necessarily in English, and you can see it has now become formulaic. The Metropolitan Museum of Art is situated in Lenapehoking, homeland of the Lenape diaspora. I mean, this discourse is completely our discourse. I've compared in my other Asias the so-called Afghan constitution to how much, although it's supposedly written in Dari, it's not, how much the Dari is translations of English discursive production. Situated in Lenapehoking, homeland of the Lenape diaspora, and historically a gathering and trading place for many diverse native peoples who continue to live and work on this island. We respectfully acknowledge and honor all indigenous communities, past, present, and future. easily said, for their ongoing and fundamental relationships to the region. The Lenapes, like subaltern Africans, were multilingual, and Lenape itself is, like Yoruba, a collective singular name for a multiplicity. What is it simply to say, we are sitting on your land, but we respect you, when we are in the metropolis? We are not speaking of open-air museums, Yosemite, etc., not of creating the artificial natural. I am speaking of the fact that at the end of Capital Volume 1, Karl Marx suggests that the capitalization of land, read spectralization, museumization, capitalization of land gives so-called primitive accumulation, making industrial capitalism possible, the first step of colonialism. This cannot be undone by an acknowledgement, thus allowing the, quote, Native American the same modernity as ourselves, which is correct, in today's contested future, rather than propose sustainable tourism, I quote the World Monument Heritage Fund. We should all learn to undo our minds, to realize that the world itself can only acknowledge that it was imposed on commons, not land acknowledgement, but more. For this, one of our tasks, indicated by suggestions, for example, that I gave to the World Economic Forum and Comparative Education Society, is to impart to the indigenous a real sense of the cartographic world, rather than dwell on the fact that most indigenous languages have a word for world, but not for colonialism or deconstruction. I want to place myself on the map right here, basing myself on the fact, Surya, fact that as the red arrow indicates, 158th Street, my address, was a path to the river for gathering clams before the Dutch came. I told former Mayor Bloomberg that I was a pre-Columbian Indian, to his infinite derision. They found stuff when they made that subway thing on 158th Street. I'm not acknowledging anything. I want to be, and this is an unbelievably literary task, to get into the space of the other. Now the real question, how is this tremendous epistemological performance, sustained by imaginative activism rather than cost effectiveness, to be achieved? Perhaps it will hit us by creative chance. Aristotle calls this touche, as we perform the short-term tasks assiduously, without personal politics, the networking, the diversifying, the employment practices, and so on, assiduously, without personal politics. Or, bigger yet, let us turn to the end of that citation from the mad mathematician-philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. When we arbitrarily conceptualize something, we are not surprised by those pictures enough to say, look there. This translation, I've modified the translation completely. We must wait for the reimagined metamuseality as dictated by the planetary to surprise us as we keep on doing the assiduous work. In summary then, short-term solutions must be worked at. Decolonizing is ideologically imposed by neoliberalism. Deconstruction, methodologically practiced, can lead to affirmative sabotage of land acknowledgement, displacing itself, confronting planetarity. Examples from Mother, Grandchild, Rural Schools, Asian Antiquity. Thank you.
Professor Spivak, thank you so much for that really rousing and thought-provoking keynote. I really appreciate it. And I think that you've given us much food for thought over the next couple of days. I would love to maybe just start, talking about the point that you made about this idea of colonialization and this idea of, thinking about the perspective skewing our perception. And I think just in terms of as we move forward through the panels over the next couple of days, and, one really think about best practices for the short term recommendations that you've made to enable to engender the long-term shift. How can we ground ourselves, or to kind of make sure that we are not as I think your mother had exemplified, using our own ideas of this ideological discrepancy, I guess, or how do we make sure that we don't stay too much within and remember to look outside, and to make sure that we are being, open and considering other perspectives?
That's a wonderful question, Michelle. And, I share the same problem here. So I'll not really give you an answer, but I will discuss what I kind of try to do. The Frederick Douglass certainly knew what he was talking about. He suggested, like many others, that when the problem seems solved, that's when the problems begin. So I think what I have learned in a decades long life of, however small it is, extra academic activism, it's not a big deal. I know activists who are much better, work much more than I do, but nonetheless, it's real. But what I have learned is that when it seems as if I have solved a problem, to sit down, not just myself, but the people with whom I have worked, and ask what problems have arisen because this problem seems solved. So that's just one little suggestion, that when we achieve a goal, to stop and ask what can go wrong. Because this is also, I'll just put one more thing in and then we can continue the discussion. This is also the idea of the future anterior, isn't it? Something will have happened which will not be identical with just what we have planned. This is just a fact. It's not some wonderful theoretical idea. This is everybody knows this. So therefore, to keep this in mind, that what we plan and the future anterior, it'll always be different. So, and you will never be able to compensate for it. Your computers will not be able to program for it. The contingent cannot be caught by the digital. I think those two things, Michelle, at this point in a short discussion, I think those are the two things I would say.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We'll certainly keep that in mind. And I think, towards that end, I think that it is a very interesting point that you made, that, rather this kind of colonial, more of a political domination, maybe has, we've understood the problematics of that. But I think you raised this interesting point of caste and class, and that one perhaps snafu, or one kind of booby trap of this idea of kind of singling out or raising up communities, is this idea of kind of thinking about them as a monolith, right? I mean, when we talk about Asian Americans or even Chinese Americans, they become
Wonderful.
this kind of monolithic community, whereas it is really, there's so many more nuances. And, we've talked in other contexts here at Asia Society about the Chinese American community actually being the most disparate in terms of economic,
Yes.
success, or, there's the Chinese Americans or Asian Americans are the most impoverished and also the richest. And so that disparity is the greatest. And so how can we, I think it's really important to keep in mind these other dichotomies, and the risk of this kind of work that we're embarking on in these next couple of days is not to then, then ghettoize in another way groups of people and ideas. So I really appreciate it. perspective. And I really wanted to then maybe delve a little bit into the relationship of the Anthropocene and the environment.
I can't hear you. I can't hear you. I can't hear you. I can't hear you. Relationship, and then I lost you.
Sorry, the relationship of the Anthropocene and the environment
Mm-hmm.
to greater equity and accessibility. And I would love if you could maybe elaborate on strategies on how to better, I guess, not marry, but to, to bring elements of the Anthropocene and art and the climate and environment into our museological work, how that can really come to play.
Again, an important question, but an almost impossible question at this point, which is why I was talking about, being surprised. You see, for us literary critics or viewers in the museum, it's very easy to talk about being surprised because that is really our way of dealing with. I mean, people ask me about genres, what do I like best, and I always say, well, listen, something else will come down the pike and surprise me tomorrow. So I can't tell you anything about genres. So that's a different thing. But nonetheless, I will say that to combat the Anthropocene is almost impossible. Some people want to call it the Capitalocene. I think that's 100% mistake, because the Anthropocene, the relationship between the human being and so-called nature, that is the beginning. For the human to separate from nature is the beginning of the Anthropocene. And in fact, once again, if I may, I read Marx. He's my brother. He's a 19th century philosopher. There are many things that he thinks about that are so very sharp that I get a lot of material from him. You see, he, unlike Engels, he was aware that even in nature there is exchange value. He called it in German Stoffwechsel, which is translated metabolism. So we lose it, but Wechsel is, of course, exchange of material. And so therefore, that relationship, the relationship between human and natural, is in fact one which needs to be contained and restrained, and it's almost impossible, because the definition of the natural, the definition of the human, is that we can make more than we need. And in that difference is art, is capital, is love, is mourning, is judgment. It's everything. That difference between how much we need and how much we can make. So therefore, the kind of pious decision that we are going to undermine the Anthropocene by walking from here to China, it's not so easy. So that the idea of, what we should have learned before was restraint, but we did not learn it. We learned greed is the basic human affect, and we did not learn that greed should be contained. So even now, this nonsensical sustainable tourism, this kind of stuff is going into, I'm confronting this also in Africa in a way that I cannot discuss. But this notion of it's almost too late to think about this. And if I may take one more minute of your time, I hope people will understand that when I was talking about also reaching out to the lowest sectors of the electorate, to romanticize them and to think that they are in tune with nature is simply that, romanticizing. I sometimes access them through proverbs, Michelle, because proverbs are for them sometimes the public sphere, history, all that stuff that we have access to through our education. So we have a proverb which says, Lobhe paap, pape mrityu, through greed, sin, through sin, death. So I asked them, it's true, isn't it? Greed is a sin, isn't it? And so say, yes. I said, don't lie. We are all greedy. We can't stop being greedy. We are greedy for our children if we are not for ourselves. So I'll rewrite it for you. So I said to them, Lobhe labh, out of greed, profit. Aker labhe, oneker mrityu. One person profits, many people die. So this is a way of interfering with their common sense, to go into proverbs. So to an extent, the idea of how to go against nature, how to dehumanize ourselves, really, is it's a tremendous, it's necessary but impossible to confront the Anthropocene. It's not easily done. But these young women who were at CAP 26, they certainly have taken it to an extreme obsessive point, and that is good too. I think we need to develop something like an obsession rather than be reasonable about this. Sorry, it took a little long because you asked me a question that hits me right close to the heart.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, and really, we want to hear from you for sure. I mean, and I think that is a really important, way of thinking and contextualizing. I mean, and I love the idea that you're thinking or communicating through proverbs or through, these kinds of parables, because I do think that, as that history is so subjective, as we know, right? And it's usually the victors who are defining history. And so as that changes, and those who are trying to become dominant, whether it's a colonial master or it is, the neoliberals, as you note, that are trying to define how we see the world, and who are the we. I love how you say, who are the we? Like, who are we today, and what do we aspire to, and what does that mean, and how inclusive is that? Who is the we that we are talking about, right? And who's included in that we? And I wonder, as many of the museum professionals and leaders in the arts that are in the audience and will be speaking later, are trying to be more, to make our platforms more accessible, to engage more broadly in different dialogues. How do we do that in a mindful and thoughtful and strategic way that we don't dilute the conversation to be just a bunch of gobbledygook or just into chaos? I mean, how do you recommend we streamline or, structure these types of engagements so that we can have meaningful discourse?
Yes, and of course, Michelle, I mean, each question that you asked, really, it's absolutely important to consider them. Basically, of course, it's case by case, as you well know, being a very practical, successful person. But nonetheless, I would give as a general thing, what I was trying to say right at the end, that I'm trying to enter that space, that red arrow, the 158th Street, walking down to the river for clams, etc. That's the literary. The literary, which is why one has lived with the literary all one's life. The literary is trying as hard as possible to be strong enough, one's imagination is strong enough so that one goes as far out as possible through that strength of the imagination into the other space. And that's the only way that you can engage. In your day-to-day work, engage with the people with whom you have a continuity. It seems that's what we do. I mean, classroom teaching is to develop continuity. But on the other hand, and I'll give you an example which I think will speak to you, Michelle. See, I was working in China, and Indians and Chinese, they have a certain kind of nationalist competition, as well as appreciation for each other, great Asian civilizations, and so on. And so what I was trying to do, which is almost impossible for someone who is Indian and lives in the United States to do, 2 counts against believing that the Chinese are as we are. Okay, 2 counts. But nonetheless, as a literary person taught by excellent teachers, I tried, and I learned Chinese. I mean, I've been learning Chinese now for some time. I tried to enter into the Chinese. And the talk I gave there, Michelle, which if I had time, I would have shared today, it's called, think about it, it's called Imperatives to Reimagine the Silk Road. That's the talk I gave in Kunming the last time I was in China, invited by the chancellor there, and talking to all of the Chinese teachers who were doing their own projects, listening to the projects and so on and so forth. Imperative, but speaking as if I were Chinese, thinking of that Zhongguo in the central kingdom, as the Silk Road and the whole world and what's happening to it now, and the difference between the teachers and the head of state. It was just an amazing exercise for me. Imperative to reimagine the Silk Road. And I actually did talk about imperative, also from the proletarian revolution in Marx and so on and so forth. So therefore, this question, how do we address them? You are so right that it is completely there for us to turn it into diluted gobbledygook. Everyone comes in with a little cultural statement, and it's really insulting. It's like a menagerie. It's like a little zoological garden. You have one person from each place, and they know everything. No, you're absolutely correct. That's not the way to go. If one wants to go that way, then one takes this trouble of trying to enter imaginatively into that space. What one should continue to do is very hard with the ones with whom one establishes continuity, and then focus out from there. So again, in a brief while, I can't say very much more than this, but this has been my methodology all my life, and it still is. It's not today, it's not very popular anymore in digital humanities, but that's all right. I'll be dead soon, I think. So I do what I can.
No, but I mean, it's a really powerful methodology and perspective, and I think it's one that will really carry us very far through our sessions this week. So I really appreciate your thoughtful responses. So I'm going to open the session up for some questions from the audience to give other people opportunities. So one of the questions that we have, Professor Spivak, is, do you consider soft power as an agent in colonization? You could address that.
Say again,
do you consider
consider
soft power as an agent in colonization? So arts and culture.
You know, I can't. Do I consider what power?
Oh, soft power. So arts and culture.
I couldn't.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, soft power. In an agent in what?
Colonization.
An agent. Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, it has been. You see, this again. This is a good question. It has been very much hearts and minds. You know, I mean, one only has to read Quiet American by Graham Greene. So yes, certainly so. And the thing is, however, what we have to look at, if you look at it's called cultural geographies, the current issue of cultural geographies. There is an article by a former student at Columbia called Colleen Parsons. It's about Ireland and colonization in Ireland. And Colleen makes the point that colonialism is extremely diverse. There are certainly very general principles, but the soft power stuff is very, very diverse. The use of soft power in Algeria and Vietnam was not the same. The use of soft power in Senegal, and especially Saint-Louis in Senegal, and let's say Mali, was not the same. And certainly it's a scandal that the use of soft power in India and in Africa was not only not the same, but one was used over against the other. So to an extent, the person who asks this question, I very much agree that perhaps the in some ways powerful as economic power and political power in colonialism. But we also have to look, my friend, at the early days of colonialism, when there is a lot of collaboration, especially on the soft power level. There is a lot. I mean, this you go and look at the documents, and you will see that in the historical situation how much collaboration there is, so that our Orientalist vision of what colonialism is will not take us too far. I'm glad you asked this question. Yes, soft power is an agent.
No, I wholeheartedly agree in certain cases. I mean, and I think in terms of the relationship of economies and culture, I mean, I think you can see that in many instances. I mean, I think, looking at contemporary mainland China, which was the contemporary art district, it became the third most popular tourist spot after the Great Wall and the Forbidden City. And so the government took great interest and pride, and then it became, kind of internalized and nationalized and lionized, and used as a vehicle for other, means by the government. So I wholeheartedly agree. So the next question would be, what would your ideal art museum in 100 years look like?
It would be like a buckyball. No, I'm joking. I'm joking. It's a very sweet question, but the future anterior, and especially I'll be 80 in February. The idea of thinking for 100 years ahead, it just isn't my thing. And now, which Capitalization told us, the world. I mean, I don't want to be like, and use the word capitalist in a kind of childish way, but it did really show how, I use the word greed. I think that's a better word. It told us how greed will still not learn that the world can come to an end. So therefore, now that's what I was saying. Future thinking is even more difficult for me when I think about the next generation. So what are we leaving for future generations? That possibility, even the luxury of thinking, hey, what will it be in 100 years? That luxury is kind of gone. But thank you for the question. It's a lovely question, but that's really not my way.
Thank you for indulging that. And so the final question for this session comes from the audience. The question is, you speak of utilizing one's imagination to enter spaces. Imagination seems to be central to your work. What is your relationship with your own imagination, and what are your hopes for imagination?
Okay, now imagination has to be trained, okay? It's not like you can just, one of the worst possible things in the United States, I've lived here for 60 years and taught at a university full-time for 56 years. And I've worked all the way, Iowa, Texas, Emory, Pittsburgh, Columbia, and taught in California for a long time, etc. So I know something. There are many wonderful things about the United States student, but one of the worst things is deciding on an ignorant imagination and calling it freedom. Today we see freedom of choice. Today we see it in the worst way with the vaccination business. So that an imagination is very powerful. It's not something that you can just call up. Oh, I'm imagining. I don't really quite know how to call on it. I can pray to be haunted and know that prayer, the other thing, is asking the imagination to do something. I even say, I remember, not just today, but I am a trainer of the imagination, right? I'm a literature teacher. I don't teach anything else. And so I as a teacher would say, I remember in the 70s at Brown, when I was teaching Derrida for the first time, teaching Proust, I would walk around and I would say, basically to my imagination, I suppose, Pegasus, rise, Okirat, Pakakulo, because I couldn't do anything because it wasn't moving. It wasn't moving. So to an extent, it has to be trained. And so I can say nothing about my imagination. One thing, however, You see, these folks whom I've been teaching in the rural areas now for 35 years, their head has been completely cognitively damaged through the caste system imposing obedience, okay? They have cunning. They can be quickly taught some moves on the computer and, you can make money, etc. But they have not been allowed to think thoughts that are not necessarily useful for anything. So therefore, when you teach them, you don't know how to get to them to open their minds. On the other hand, the imagination is there. The imagination is there. That's another thing. It's tough as hell. You can't destroy it, but it has to be trained. And as to how to describe it, it's very hard just to describe it in third persons. If I see you, today I'm in Calcutta, but when I'm back in New York, if I see you, we can do something together and you will see. It's like that. It's a doing thing, not really a describe. I mean, the 18th century in Europe really tried to describe it. They did a good job, but it was just talk the talk, not really walk the walk.
It was very confining.
So that's,
Yep.
that's it. But thanks.
I think we actually have time for maybe one or two more questions. And I think this next question really ties into this idea about what you were saying about your rural students and how, they've been so kind of constrained by this identity that has been, superimposed on them through the caste system. So this question asks, can Professor Spivak tease out a little how she thinks of the line between holding space for other viewpoints and the myth of authenticity of the other and the danger of othering or self-othering? So kind of that constraining of that self-definition or kind of imposing those definitions.
Okay, now give me the three again, because this is a little bit like an oral exam question.
Sure,
so what can I do?
So
okay, do what?
What you think of the line between holding space for other viewpoints and the myth of authenticity of the other and the danger of othering or self-othering?
Okay. This is again, you should really read Adorno, who's much smarter than I, but I can give you whatever answer I can. I think all of this work, when it's done, it's like sinking or swimming, okay? When you're actually doing it, you're not, it's like athletes, they practice a lot, but when they're actually in the field and when they're playing, the muscle memory actually works. I mean, when you do play slowly, you see that the moves that they made, they were not thinking about making those moves, right? So whatever I say now is not really what one does as one is actually I'm a classroom teacher, and that's where all of this works. I don't think I can hold space for anyone, okay? I really, this business of wanting to get into the other space, it's a very difficult thing to do. It's like, as I say, it's necessary but impossible. Even now, it's a struggle. And given the fact that I have, after all, a personality which might want to clash with this, because as a woman, not kind of teaching India or being a professional Indian or anything, but actually competing in the teaching of English, French, and German, and with a BA from the University of Calcutta, I really had to, and remember, we are talking, my BA is in 1959, long before multiculturalism, this, that. I mean, I was going to be deported from Cornell because they would give me a teaching assistantship because my native language wasn't English. This is 1962. I was 20. No work permit, no nothing, no visa. I was going to be deported. So therefore, I have had to soldier all my life. Therefore, it has given me a certain kind of personality which is into another space. So therefore, you also have to think about that. Everybody somehow pretends that they're very good teachers. I'm not a very good teacher. I can just describe what I think needs to be done, and I try to do it. So I don't think I can hold space forever. I can know that I must not come back to myself over and over and over again. I must listen to the other part of the other person is. I must say before I start with no. That's what I have absolutely no clue about authenticity, none. So I'm not interested.
I think we might have lost you, Professor Spivak. Your internet, I think, just went out for a moment.
Okay, now?
Yes.
Now it's okay?
Better.
Okay. So what I say about authenticity, what is one authentic as? A concept that things can be authentic in order for, so I don't have any use for authentic anything. So that one I can't really answer. It's not a word that speaks to me. As for self-othering, see, these are words. It seems, I am myself other to myself when I think of myself as a myself. This is just a simple, and my problem is that I read a lot of Hegel. Don't read Hegel, he thought Africans were animals. I read Hegel and I despise the fact that he said Africans were animals. I can take what I can and then I can combat him. He was also a very smart man. I was married to a person who thought Arabs were animals. The marriage broke up, but he, after all, was a human being, died in 2016. So this is, and in Hegel, there is so much about the fact that what is produced as a sense of myself, just what in Surya, who's doing my PowerPoint, and myself, the three of us are reading this bit from the second notes together. Therefore, some other areas, something undone. My diabetes. I use my father was a doctor, and my uncle was an accountant. And my uncle had diabetes, and my uncle would come home after a hard day's work and fall asleep. Even I knew, my father died when I was 13 years old, so we're talking about when I'm 11 or 12. Even I knew that if you had diabetic coma, you'd come out of it. But people generally love everything about their diseases if it's chronic. So, and my father was a doctor. And so we would go to visit every evening, and my dad would tell my father all of the things that happened in the day. And then say, and then I had a bit of diabetic coma, and then I got up. And my father never contradicted him. My father allowed him to think that he really had diabetic coma every day. And so when I was teaching deconstruction first, and to wonderful students like Forrest Pyle and so on, I used the concept of my uncle's diabetic coma to describe the people who said they were living deconstructively. And so, to an extent, this idea of self-othering is a little bit, to me, like that kind of psychologizing, possibilizing things that are really not psychologically possible. And you see, I will say this also. She was a hero for working so well when she was in advanced stages of cancer, etc., except the work that she, David Miller, and others did was to completely psychologize psychoanalysis so that the way in which the two people working together in psychoanalysis, whether you like it or not, I've never been in analysis, but if you want to try to at least believe that something comes up through two people working together, if you psychologize it, and you can say you can self-other, you can access this part of the paranoia, and you can do reparation and so on and so forth, you are psychologizing something which is not, in fact, psychological. So for me, self-othering would be like that diabetic coma business of my uncle's, which really helped me as a concept, or this psychologizing of something that is not accessible to psychology. I don't think I think it's not a serious idea. The very first one, holding space, that one, one should watch it. One should not think that one can, but one should try. Thank you for your question.
Professor Spivak, thank you so much for your generosity of time and wisdom. I think that your pioneering work has been such a touchstone for so many of us in the field, and I know that this conversation and your presentation will certainly be a touchstone for the summit. So I do look forward to reconvening with you at the close, hopefully when you're back in New York, if not before, and to see if we have been successful in following your directives in this keynote. So thank you so much again. And we look forward to hosting you again at Asia Society. Thank you.